It started as just another busy morning at Cafe Bell, a cozy coffee shop tucked away on a quiet street in the heart of the bustling city. The cafe had been around for years, known for its warm atmosphere, delicious pastries, and coffee that could wake anyone up, no matter how tired they were. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sweet aroma of muffins and cookies filled the air, wrapping the cafe in a comforting embrace. The soft hum of chatter, the clinking of cups, and the gentle notes of jazz music playing in the background created the perfect setting for a new day. For Clara Jenkins, the morning began the way it always did. She arrived early, just as the first light of dawn peeked over the rooftops. The streets were still quiet, and the city hadn't yet woken up. Clara liked this time of day. It gave her a chance to breathe, to gather her thoughts before the hustle and bustle of the cafe took over. Clara was young, only 23, but life had already thrown its share of challenges her way. She had grown up in a small town, dreaming of a better life in the big city. When she was younger, she'd often sit by her window, staring at the stars, imagining herself doing something great. She didn't know exactly what it would be, but she was determined to make something of herself. Moving to the city had been her first big step. She had packed everything she owned into one suitcase and boarded a bus, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. When she arrived, the towering buildings and endless streets had overwhelmed her. But Clara was nothing if not resilient. She found a tiny apartment, just big enough for a bed and a small kitchen, and started looking for work. That's how she ended up at Cafe Bell. The cafe wasn't glamorous, but it was cozy, and the people who worked there felt like a little family. Clara had been hired as a waitress 6 months ago. At first, she had been nervous, unsure if she could keep up with the fast pace and demanding customers. But over time, she learned the rhythm of the job. She knew how to carry 3 plates at once without dropping them, how to make perfect latte art when the barista was too busy, and how to keep a polite smile even when a customer was being rude. Clara loved her job most days. She liked seeing the regulars who came in every morning, the elderly couple who always shared a scone, the young woman who brought her laptop and worked for hours while sipping chai, and the man who always ordered a black coffee and read the newspaper. She liked the way the sunlight streamed through the large windows, making the cafe feel warm and welcoming. But not every day was easy. The cafe attracted all kinds of people. Some were kind, leaving generous tips and thanking her with genuine smiles. Others were impatient, tapping their feet if their coffee took too long or complaining about the smallest things. Clara had learned to handle them all with grace. But then there were customers like Eleanor Hastings. Eleanor wasn't just any customer. She was the kind of woman who made an impression the moment she walked into a room. Tall, elegant, and always dressed in the latest designer clothes, Eleanor carried herself with an air of importance. Her heels clicked loudly against the tiled floor, and her eyes scanned the cafe as if she were inspecting it. Her jewelry sparkled under the soft cafe lights, and her perfume lingered in the air long after she passed by. Eleanor had a way of making people feel small. She didn't shout or throw tantrums. Instead, her sharp words and condescending tone cut through the air like a knife. To her, people like Clara were invisible, or worse, beneath her notice. Clara had dealt with Eleanor before. She came to the cafe often, always ordering the same thing: a double espresso with a splash of cream. She would sit at her favorite table by the window, scrolling through her phone or flipping through a glossy magazine, and she always found something to complain about. The coffee was too hot, the cream wasn't fresh, the table wasn't clean enough. Clara had learned to brace herself whenever she saw Eleanor walk through the door. She would take a deep breath, put on her best smile, and do her job. She had heard the other waitresses whispering about Eleanor, calling her Queen Hastings behind her back. But Clara tried not to judge. She didn't know Eleanor's story, and she believed in treating everyone with kindness, no matter how they acted. But today felt different. Clara couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something in the air. Maybe it was the way the sunlight seemed brighter than usual, casting long shadows across the floor. Or maybe it was the nervous energy she felt as she tied her apron and prepared for her shift. Whatever it was, Clara had a feeling that this day would be anything but ordinary. The morning rush began as usual. Customers streamed in, placing their orders, chatting with friends, or settling into their favorite seats. Clara moved quickly, balancing trays of coffee and plates of pastries, her smile never wavering. She greeted the regulars by name, made small talk with new customers, and kept the line moving. Just as she was catching her breath, the familiar sound of clicking heels reached her ears. Clara turned toward the door, and there she was, Eleanor Hastings. Eleanor stepped into the cafe, her designer coat draped over her shoulders, and her sunglasses perched on her perfectly styled hair. She paused for a moment, looking around the room as if deciding whether it was worth her time. Clara watched as the other customers shifted uncomfortably, some casting curious glances at the elegant woman who had just entered. Eleanor walked to the counter with slow, deliberate steps. She didn't bother waiting in line. Instead, she stopped in front of Clara, her manicured fingers tapping the counter. "Good morning, Mrs. Hastings," Clara said, her voice steady. "What can I get for you today?" Eleanor's lips curved into a small, tight smile. "The usual," she said, her tone clipped. Clara nodded and quickly prepared the double espresso with a splash of cream. She placed the cup on the counter and slid it toward Eleanor. Eleanor picked up the cup, her perfectly arched eyebrows furrowing slightly. She took a sip, and then, without a word, she set the cup down with a loud clink. "This is unacceptable," Eleanor said, her voice sharp enough to make the barista behind Clara freeze mid-pour. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is something wrong?" Eleanor crossed her arms, her expression one of pure disdain. "It's lukewarm. I don't pay good money for lukewarm coffee." Clara opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could say a word, Eleanor raised the cup and tipped it over, letting the coffee spill across the counter. The dark liquid spread quickly, dripping onto the floor and soaking into Clara's apron. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The cafe fell silent, the hum of conversation and clinking of cups fading into the background. All eyes turned to Clara and Eleanor, the tension in the air so thick it was almost tangible. Clara's hands trembled as she grabbed a towel and began wiping up the mess. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she refused to let Eleanor see her cry. "Clean this up," Eleanor said, her voice cold and dismissive, "and make me another coffee. Hot this time." As Clara cleaned the counter, her mind raced. She had dealt with rude customers before, but this was different. This wasn't just rudeness, it was cruelty. And for the first time, Clara felt something shift inside her. She looked up at Eleanor, her eyes steady and unflinching. "Of course, ma'am," she said, her voice calm. But deep down, Clara knew that this day, this moment, would change everything. Clara could feel Eleanor's presence before she even saw her. It was like the air in the cafe shifted whenever the woman walked in. The sharp clack of Eleanor's designer heels echoed off the tiled floor, each step announcing her arrival like a warning. The soft murmur of conversations at the tables quieted, and a few heads turned, their curiosity drawn by the woman who always seemed to command attention. Even the regulars, who were used to Eleanor's dramatic entrances, couldn't help but glance her way. Clara, busy wiping down a table near the back of the cafe, tensed. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Only Eleanor Hastings could create such a stir just by walking through the door. Clara straightened her apron and took a deep breath, bracing herself. It was just another day, she told herself. Just another customer. But deep down, Clara knew Eleanor wasn't just any customer. Eleanor wasn't the type to wait quietly in line or say a polite thank you when handed her coffee. No, Eleanor was the kind of person who treated every interaction like a test of authority, a test Clara always felt she was destined to fail. "Excuse me." The sharp voice rang out, cutting through the quiet hum of the cafe. Clara froze for a moment, the rag still in her hand, before turning toward the counter. There she was, Eleanor Hastings. She stood tall and imposing, her perfectly tailored coat draped over her shoulders, a pair of oversized sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Her perfectly styled hair framed her face, and her lips were painted a bold shade of red that matched the soles of her designer heels. Clara noticed the steaming cup of coffee in Eleanor's hand. Her heart sank. Eleanor's eyes were narrowed, her expression a mix of anger and disgust. She waved the cup slightly, her manicured nails glinting under the soft cafe lights. "Is this how you treat paying customers?" she demanded, her voice cold and clipped. "My coffee is lukewarm." Clara quickly stepped behind the counter, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Let me fix that for you." But Eleanor wasn't interested in an apology or a solution. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze icy and piercing. "Fix it," she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "You can't even do your job right." Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain calm. "I'll make you a fresh cup right away," she said, her tone as polite as she could manage. She reached for the cup in Eleanor's hand, hoping to diffuse the situation. But then it happened. Without warning, Eleanor raised the cup higher, and in one swift motion, she threw the coffee at Clara. The hot liquid splashed across Clara's apron and shirt, soaking the fabric and dripping onto the floor. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The cafe fell silent, the usual hum of chatter and clinking dishes replaced by a tense, almost deafening stillness. Every eye in the room turned to Clara and Eleanor, the scene unfolding like something out of a dramatic movie. Clara stood motionless, her hands still half raised, as if she were holding an invisible tray. The shock of what had just happened hit her like a wave. The coffee wasn't scalding hot, but it was warm enough to make her skin sting slightly. Her cheeks burned, not from the heat, but from the humiliation. Eleanor, meanwhile, stood tall and unapologetic, her expression cold and indifferent. She glanced down at Clara, as if she were no more than a nuisance, a fly to be swatted away. "Maybe now you'll learn to do your job properly," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Clara's mind raced. Part of her wanted to scream, to shout back at Eleanor, and tell her how unfair and cruel she was being. Another part of her wanted to run out of the cafe, away from the stairs and the tension, and never come back. But Clara did neither. Instead, she reached for a towel, her hands shaking slightly, and began wiping at the spilled coffee on her apron. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The room remained silent as Clara cleaned up the mess. Even the other employees, who usually jumped in to help each other, seemed frozen in place, unsure of how to handle the situation. The customers at the nearby tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some exchanging nervous glances, others pretending to be deeply interested in their cups of coffee. Eleanor watched Clara for a moment longer, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. Then, with a dramatic sigh, she set the empty cup down on the counter. "I'll be waiting for my replacement," she said, her tone impatient. Clara nodded, avoiding Eleanor's gaze, and quickly turned to make another coffee. Her hands moved on autopilot, measuring the espresso, steaming the milk, and pouring the drink into a new cup. She placed it on the counter with a careful smile. "Here you go, Mom. Fresh and hot." Eleanor picked up the cup, took a small sip, and then nodded slightly, as if she were granting her approval. Without another word, she turned and walked toward her usual table by the window, her heels clicking against the floor. As soon as Eleanor was out of earshot, the cafe seemed to come back to life. The soft buzz of conversation resumed, and the clinking of cups and spoons filled the air once more. But the tension lingered, like a storm cloud that hadn't quite passed. Clara took a deep breath and glanced down at her apron, which was still damp with coffee. She felt a lump form in her throat, but swallowed it down, determined not to cry. She couldn't let Eleanor, or anyone else, see how much the incident had shaken her. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Clara went through the motions, taking orders, delivering drinks, and cleaning tables, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop replaying the scene in her head, the shock of the coffee hitting her, the coldness in Eleanor's eyes, and the way the entire cafe had fallen silent, all eyes on her. As the day wore on, Clara found herself growing more and more frustrated, not just with Eleanor, but with herself. Why hadn't she stood up for herself? Why had she let Eleanor treat her that way without saying a word? By the time the cafe closed for the day, Clara was emotionally exhausted. She stayed behind to clean up, scrubbing the counters and mopping the floors with more force than necessary. Her coworkers offered her sympathetic looks, but said nothing, sensing that she needed space. When Clara finally stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her like a balm. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the crisp breeze wash over her. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. But as she walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, Clara made a decision. She wasn't going to let Eleanor, or anyone else, make her feel small anymore. This was the turning point. She didn't know how yet, but something had to change. And deep down, Clara knew that this moment, painful as it was, might just be the spark she needed to finally take control of her life. Clara stood there for a moment, frozen. The hot coffee soaked through her apron, spreading warmth across her stomach and leaving a sticky sensation on her skin. Her mind raced, but her face remained calm. She refused to let Eleanor see the effect of her actions. Slowly, Clara wiped her hands on a napkin, took a deep breath, and turned away. Behind the counter, Clara's coworkers exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered among themselves, but no one dared to step in earlier. Now one of them, a young barista named Mia, leaned closer to Clara. "Are you okay?" Maya asked in a hushed tone, her eyes filled with concern. "I'm fine," Clara replied softly, managing a small, reassuring smile. But inside, her emotions churned. Anger, humiliation, and determination swirled together like a storm. Clara wasn't fine. Not really. But she had learned long ago how to hide her feelings behind a calm exterior. Clara picked up a fresh rag and began wiping down the counter. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if the act of cleaning could scrub away the frustration building within her. As she worked, her mind was already working on a plan. She had seen Eleanor's type before. Wealthy, entitled, and used to getting their way. People like Eleanor thought they could act without consequences, that their status or money made them untouchable. But what Eleanor didn't know was that Clara had been keeping a journal, a detailed record of every rude customer, every unfair interaction, and every moment of mistreatment she had endured since starting her job at Cafe Bell. It wasn't something Clara had planned initially. The journal had started as a way to vent her frustrations in private, a place where she could pour out her feelings without fear of judgment. But over time, it had become more than that. It was a testament to her resilience, a reminder of everything she had endured and overcome. And Eleanor's name. It wasn't unfamiliar to Clara. Weeks ago, Clara had come across Eleanor's name in a newspaper article. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. The article was about a high-profile charity event, one of those lavish galas attended by the city's elite. Eleanor Hastings had been featured prominently, her name mentioned alongside several influential figures. The piece praised her for her generosity and dedication to helping underprivileged children. But now, standing behind the counter with coffee still clinging to her apron, Clara thought back to that article. The Eleanor Hastings described in the newspaper, the philanthropic socialite, was worlds apart from the woman who had just thrown coffee at a waitress. The contrast was stark, and it made Clara wonder. Was Eleanor really the kind, generous person the media portrayed her to be? Or was she simply playing a role, hiding her true nature behind a carefully crafted image? The more Clara thought about it, the more curious she became. That night, after her shift ended, Clara went home and pulled out her journal. She flipped through the pages, skimming over the entries she had written in the past. Each page told a story, some frustrating, others heartbreaking. But Eleanor's name stood out, bold and underlined, on one of the most recent entries. She wrote about what had happened that day in meticulous detail. Eleanor's cold tone, the way she had thrown the coffee, and the smirk on her face afterward. Clara didn't know what she would do with the information yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Eleanor get away with treating people like that. The next day, Clara decided to do some digging. On her lunch break, she sat in the corner of the cafe with her laptop open. She searched Eleanor's name online, scrolling through articles, social media posts, and photos. Most of what she found painted a glowing picture of Eleanor as a generous, successful woman who was deeply involved in charity work. But as Clara dug deeper, she began to notice cracks in the facade. There were rumors, comments on forums, and social media posts from people claiming to have encountered Eleanor in less than flattering situations. A former employee of one of Eleanor's companies had written a scathing review about her, describing her as demanding, rude, and completely out of touch with reality. Another person, a former assistant, had shared a story about being fired after making a small mistake. Clara leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. The more she learned about Eleanor, the more complicated the picture became. She wasn't just a one-dimensional villain, but she wasn't the saint the media made her out to be either. Still, none of this changed what had happened in the cafe. Clara decided to take things one step further. After work, she visited the local library and borrowed books on workplace rights and customer service policies. She wanted to know exactly what her options were, both legally and professionally. She wasn't planning to file a lawsuit or create a public scandal, at least not yet, but she wanted to be prepared. Meanwhile, at the cafe, Clara's coworkers began to rally around her. Mia, the young barista, approached her during a quiet moment. "You know, you don't have to put up with that," Maya said, her voice firm. What Eleanor did was completely unacceptable. "I know," Clara replied, her tone thoughtful. "But people like her think they can do whatever they want because no one stands up to them." Mia nodded. "Well, if you ever decide to stand up to her, you won't be alone. I've got your back." Clara smiled, grateful for the support. She hadn't realized how much her coworkers cared until now. As the days passed, Clara continued her research. She started documenting everything in her journal, not just her own experiences, but also the stories she had uncovered about Eleanor. It became a project of sorts, a way for Clara to channel her frustration into something productive. But the more she worked on it, the more she realized she wasn't just doing it for herself. She was doing it for everyone who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or underestimated. Small revelations began to surface, pieces of a puzzle Clara hadn't even realized she was trying to solve. She discovered that Eleanor's wealth came from a string of successful businesses, but many of those businesses had a history of high employee turnover. She found articles praising Eleanor's philanthropy, but some of the charities she donated to had questionable practices. It was as if two versions of Eleanor existed, the polished public figure and the demanding, difficult woman Clara had encountered in the cafe. One evening, Clara sat at her small kitchen table, her journal open in front of her. She flipped through the pages, her pen hovering over a blank space. For the first time, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know exactly what her next steps would be, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let Eleanor's actions go unnoticed. The rising tension in Clara's life wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. It was about Clara finding her voice, standing up for herself, and uncovering the truth. And though she didn't know it yet, the choices she was about to make would change her life forever. The sun had barely risen when Clara woke up, her resolve stronger than ever. She had spent the night organizing everything she had gathered. The security footage, her journal entries, and the additional information she'd uncovered about Eleanor Hastings. Today would be different. Today, Clara would take a stand. As the morning crowd began to trickle into Café Belle, Clara prepared herself mentally. She replayed her plan in her head, making sure she knew exactly what she would say and do. She wasn't sure how things would unfold, but she knew she couldn't back down now. By mid-morning, Eleanor arrived, her entrance as dramatic as ever. The sound of her designer heels clicking on the floor was enough to make heads turn. She walked in with her usual air of superiority, her expensive handbag swinging at her side. She didn't even glance at the baristas behind the counter. To her, they were invisible, just there to serve her. But today, something felt different. The cafe was unusually quiet as Eleanor approached the counter. Maya was standing there, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. Clara was in the corner, wiping down tables, but her focus was on Eleanor. The atmosphere was charged, as if everyone in the room could sense that something was about to happen. "Good morning," Eleanor said, her tone clipped. "I'll have my usual. And make sure it's hot this time." Mia exchanged a quick glance with Clara before responding. "Of course, ma'am." "Coming right up." As Mia prepared Eleanor's order, Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed this moment over and over in her mind, but now that it was here, the weight of it hit her all at once. Before Clara could speak, the cafe door opened, and a man in a suit walked in. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried a clipboard in his hand. His presence commanded attention, and it didn't take long for Eleanor to notice him. "Mrs. Hastings," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Eleanor turned to face him, her brows furrowing. "Yes, that's me. And who are you?" "I'm Mark Andrews, a representative from the city's legal department. I'm here to discuss a formal complaint that's been filed against you." Eleanor's confident demeanor faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered. "A complaint? Against me? That's absurd. There must be some mistake." Mark didn't flinch. "There's no mistake, ma'am. We have clear evidence of an incident that occurred here yesterday." At that moment, Clara stepped forward, holding a USB drive in her hand. "Remember me, Mrs. Hastings," Clara said, her voice steady. "I'm the waitress you threw coffee at yesterday. And this," she held up the USB drive, "is the security footage that proves it." Eleanor's face turned pale. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The cafe was silent, every customer and employee watching the scene unfold with bated breath. Mark continued, "We take such incidents very seriously, Mrs. Hastings. Assaulting an employee is not just unethical. It's illegal. Clara has provided us with not only the footage, but also a detailed account of what happened." Eleanor's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking. "You're all blowing this out of proportion. It was just a misunderstanding." Clara didn't back down. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her tone calm but cutting. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. You threw hot coffee at me because it wasn't perfect enough for you. That's not a misunderstanding. That's abuse." The weight of Clara's words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, Eleanor seemed at a loss, her usual confidence replaced by panic. But Clara wasn't finished. She took a step closer, her eyes locked on Eleanor's. "And while I was looking into what happened yesterday, I found something else. Something interesting about your recent charity gala." Eleanor froze, her expression shifting from panic to dread. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara pulled out a printed document from her apron pocket. "Turns out, some of the financial records for your charity event don't add up. The donations you claimed on your tax documents, they don't match the actual amounts raised. I've already forwarded the information to the proper authorities." Gasps rippled through the cafe. Customers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Clara and Eleanor. The once untouchable socialite now looked small and cornered, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Eleanor took a step back, her hands trembling. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't." Clara interrupted her. I know exactly what I'm doing, and for the first time, you're going to face the consequences of your actions. Mark stepped forward again, his tone professional but firm. Mrs. Hastings, we recommend you cooperate fully with the investigation. Refusal to do so could result in further legal action. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. She could see the writing on the wall. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the cafe, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. As the door slammed shut behind her, the cafe erupted into applause. Customers cheered, and Clara's coworkers gathered around her, their faces filled with admiration and pride. You were amazing, Maya said, hugging Clara tightly. Clara smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and triumph. For the first time in a long time, she felt powerful, not because she had brought Eleanor down, but because she had stood up for herself. She had taken control of her narrative, refusing to let someone else define her worth. The days following the confrontation at Cafe Bell were like a whirlwind. The once untouchable Eleanor Hastings, known for her wealth, elegance, and power, had been brought down by her own arrogance. As news of the incident spread, it didn't take long for word to get out. Clara's story became a topic of conversation all over town. People who had once looked past Clara, treating her as just another waitress, began to see her in a different light. She was no longer just the quiet girl behind the counter. She was now a symbol of strength, courage, and self-respect. The first few days after the event were a mix of emotions for Clara. She was still getting used to the attention that followed. At first, she had been uncomfortable with it. She had never liked being in the spotlight, but as she walked through the cafe, she could see the way her coworkers looked at her now, with respect, admiration, and even awe. It wasn't just the customers who had heard about what happened. Even the regulars, the ones who had come into the cafe every day and never really paid attention to her, now treated her differently. I can't believe you did that, one of the older customers, Mr. Jenkins, said one afternoon as Clara served him his usual coffee. You stood up to her. Most people would have just taken it, but you showed real courage. Clara smiled shyly. I didn't do it for attention, Mr. Jenkins. I just wanted to do what was right. Still, it's something to be proud of, he said with a nod. Not many people have the guts to stand up to someone like Eleanor. Clara nodded, feeling the weight of his words. He was right. She hadn't done it for the praise, but she couldn't deny that it felt good to have finally been seen. She had always been invisible in her own life, just another person moving through the world quietly, doing her job, going unnoticed. But now, she wasn't just the invisible waitress. She was someone who had made a difference. Word of Eleanor's actions spread quickly through social media, too. The video footage Clara had provided made its way onto news sites, and soon, the story of the coffee-throwing incident became viral. Eleanor's reputation, which had once been carefully built and nurtured, began to crack and crumble. No longer did people see her as the elegant, poised socialite. Instead, she was exposed for the entitled woman who thought she could treat people like dirt and get away with it. It was the beginning of the end for her carefully crafted image. As more information about Eleanor's financial misdeeds came to light, thanks to Clara's quiet research and investigation, her troubles deepened. The news of her charity gala tax fraud made headlines, and authorities began to investigate her. Legal teams were summoned, and Eleanor, once seen as a powerful and untouchable figure, now faced serious consequences for her actions. At first, Eleanor tried to keep up appearances. She issued statements claiming that she was misunderstood, that the footage had been taken out of context, and that she had always been a generous philanthropist. But the truth was now in the open. The lies she had built her life on were no longer holding up. People who had once praised her now turned their backs. No one was interested in her charity events anymore. Instead, they were focused on the criminal investigation that was unfolding. Meanwhile, Clara continued to work at Cafe Bell, but now with a newfound sense of purpose. She was no longer just a waitress. She had become a role model for the other employees. Her courage had inspired them, and they began to feel more empowered to stand up for themselves as well. No longer would they quietly accept mistreatment from difficult customers. Clara had shown them that it was possible to take a stand, even against someone as intimidating as Eleanor Hastings. The cafe owner, Mr. Thompson, was so moved by Clara's actions that he decided to implement new policies to protect his employees. He sat down with the staff and explained that no one would ever have to tolerate mistreatment from customers again. From now on, any customer who treated an employee poorly would be asked to leave the cafe, and if the situation escalated, the authorities would be involved. Clara's actions showed me just how important it is to stand up for what's right, Mr. Thompson said during a meeting with the staff. I want this place to be one where you all feel safe, respected, and valued. The new policy was a breath of fresh air for the team. They had always been afraid to speak up, worried about losing their jobs or upsetting customers. But now, they knew that they had the full support of the owner. They had a voice, and if a situation like Eleanor's ever happened again, they wouldn't hesitate to stand their ground. As for Eleanor, she never returned to Cafe Bell. After the public exposure and the ongoing investigations into her tax fraud, she disappeared from the public eye. She no longer held the power she once had. Her social circles shrank, and her invitations to high-profile events stopped coming. The world she had once owned was slipping through her fingers, and she had no one to blame but herself. Clara, on the other hand, found herself with new opportunities. Her actions had inspired not just her coworkers, but also some of the regular customers who had been following the story. They saw her as someone who had the strength to do what many others would shy away from. It wasn't long before Clara received an offer from a local news outlet to share her story. She had never imagined that her quiet life would lead to such an unexpected turn of events, but now she had a voice. She could inspire others with her story, just as she had been inspired by the courage of people who had stood up for what was right. It wasn't just about the big moments, though. Clara's life began to change in smaller ways, too. She noticed that her relationships with people had deepened. She was no longer the quiet waitress who blended into the background. People saw her for who she truly was, a person with strength, dignity, and a commitment to doing what was right, no matter the cost. And while Eleanor Hastings may have faded into obscurity, Clara's life was just beginning to bloom. She had taken back her power, and in doing so, had helped create a world where other people could do the same. She wasn't just the waitress at Cafe Bell anymore. She was Clara, the woman who stood up for herself, the woman who changed her world. As Clara looked out of the small window of Cafe Bell that evening, she couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few days. It felt almost surreal that it had all started with something as simple as a spilled cup of coffee. It had been a moment that could have easily slipped by unnoticed, but Clara had decided that it wouldn't. She had decided that she wasn't going to let someone else's behavior define how she would be treated. Sometimes, people forget that their actions have consequences. Eleanor Hastings had spent years building a life that was based on power, influence, and a kind of arrogant indifference to the feelings of others. She had believed that she could get away with anything, that her wealth and status would shield her from any real consequences. For years, it had worked. People had stepped aside, smiled, and tolerated her behavior, too afraid to speak up, too eager to keep their own positions in the world. But Clara had done something that no one expected. She had stood her ground. She had refused to be treated as less than. And in doing so, she had begun a change not only in herself, but in the entire cafe. Her quiet strength had become a spark of courage for those around her. She had shown them that standing up for yourself isn't about being loud or flashy. It's about being true to your values, no matter who stands against you. Clara had never wanted to be the center of attention. She had never imagined that she would become someone who was known for taking a stand. Her dreams had always been small, simple, just to make enough money to get by, maybe to someday leave the small town and start a new life somewhere else. But now, as she stood there, Reflecting on everything that had happened, she realized how much more there was to life than just getting by. Life wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment or waiting for someone else to take the lead. Life was about having the strength to stand up, to speak up, and to do what was right, even when it's hard. It was about taking those small moments of adversity and turning them into something bigger than yourself. It was about having resilience in the face of hardship and trusting that, in the end, doing the right thing would make a difference. Clara wasn't wealthy. She didn't have connections in high places or a network of influential people to back her up. She didn't need any of that. What she had was something far more powerful: her own voice and her ability to use it. Her strength came not from her social standing, but from the quiet determination that had always been within her, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. Looking out of the cafe window, Clara saw the city streets bustling with activity. People were moving quickly, lost in their own lives, each one focused on their own little world. Clara's small act of standing up for herself had set off a chain reaction that no one, least of all Eleanor, had seen coming. In the end, Clara's courage had been the thing that reminded everyone that no one is untouchable. Not the rich, not the famous, not the powerful. Everyone is held accountable for their actions, whether they like it or not. Clara had proven that with her own strength, her own quiet voice. She had shown that the world can change, one person at a time, if they are brave enough to stand up for what is right. Eleanor Hastings' downfall wasn't just about her behavior toward Clara. It was about everything she had done throughout her life. The lies, the manipulations, the way she had treated people as if they were beneath her. It was about the arrogance that had come from years of believing she was above reproach. But in the end, the truth caught up with her. It always does. Clara's victory wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting even. It was about justice. It was about showing the world that no one can trample over others without facing consequences. It was about standing tall, not because you have power, but because you believe in what is right. She didn't need wealth or power to make a difference. She had never needed those things. What she had was more important than any of that: resilience, courage, and a quiet determination to stand for what was just. And that, Clara realized, was the greatest strength of all. In life, people sometimes forget that their actions have consequences. But Clara had reminded everyone of an important truth: that the universe has a way of balancing things out, of showing that no one is above the laws that govern kindness, respect, and fairness. Eleanor had spent her life thinking she could avoid the consequences of her actions, but in the end, her arrogance caught up with her. She had underestimated the quiet power of someone like Clara. The greatest lesson Clara learned wasn't about defeating an enemy. It was about finding her own voice, about realizing that even the smallest action can change the course of everything. She didn't need to shout or make a spectacle of herself. She just needed to stand up, quietly and firmly, and do what was right. And that's exactly what she did. She showed everyone that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the loudest voices, but from the quietest hearts. And that, in the end, is the most powerful lesson of all.